In the vast expanse of the ancient Near East, where sand meets sky and endless horizons, there once walked figures who claimed to hear the very voice of the divine. These were not kings adorned with crowns, nor priests draped in ceremonial robes, but often simple people shepherds, farmers, scribes who found themselves called from their ordinary lives into something extraordinary. The world of the Old Testament prophets was one of dust and devotion, of wilderness wanderings and words that would echo through millennia. It was a world where the sacred and the mundane intertwined like threads in a tapestry, where a voice calling from the burning bush could change the course of nations, and where a man's journey into the desert could become humanity's journey toward understanding. Tonight, we invite you to step into that ancient landscape, to feel the desert wind on your face, to hear the crackle of evening fires in nomadic camps, and to witness the profound tension between earthly power and divine calling. This is not merely a story of religious figures from long ago. It is an exploration of human beings grappling with purpose, doubt, courage, and the weight of carrying messages too large for any one person to bear. So before we begin our journey, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations of faith and history. And let me know in the comments what story resonates with you. It's always wonderful to see. Now let's find a quiet space and drift back to a time when the boundary between heaven and earth seemed gossamer thin, and voices spoke from whirlwinds and flames. Verse 1. In the dust of the desert, a day in a prophet's camp. The sun has not yet crested the eastern hills when you stir from your sleep. The goat hair tent provides little barrier against the desert's chill, and you can feel the cold seeping through the woven fibers, through your simple woolen cloak, into your bones. This is the hour when night releases its hold, but day has not yet claimed the sky. A liminal moment that feels, somehow, sacred. You rise slowly, joints stiff from sleeping on the hard ground, and step outside into the pre-dawn darkness. Above you, the stars still burn with fierce intensity, unmarred by the glow of distant cities. Here, in this makeshift camp in the wilderness of Judea, the cosmos feels intimate and immediate. You can almost understand why your ancestors believed they could reach up and pluck the lights from heaven's vault. The small community around you is beginning to wake. There are perhaps a dozen souls who have chosen to follow you into this voluntary exile. Some are believers, drawn by your words of divine revelation. Others are family members bound by loyalty rather than faith. Still others are the curious, the desperate, those seeking something they cannot name, but hope to recognize when they find it. Your morning begins, as all mornings do, with water. In this arid landscape, water is both precious and scarce. The leather water skins, patched and repatched, contain barely enough for drinking, cooking, and the essential ritual ablutions. There is no water for luxury, no water for anything beyond survival and the sacred observances that structure your days. You pour a small amount into a clay basin, cupping it in your hands and letting it flow over your face, your hands, feeling the coolness awaken your skin. This simple act becomes a prayer, a moment of gratitude for the gift of another day, another opportunity to listen for the voice that called you here. The breakfast is simple barley cakes, dried figs, perhaps a small portion of goat cheese if the animals have been generous. You eat slowly, deliberately, aware that each bite represents effort and sacrifice. The barley was ground by hand the evening before, mixed with water and a pinch of salt, then baked on hot stones beside the fire. It is coarse, filling, sustaining. It tastes of earth and labor and the fundamental sustenance that keeps body and soul together. As the sun climbs higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, you turn to the work that defines you, not the physical labor of survival, though that too demands attention, but the work of listening. You find a quiet place apart from the camp, perhaps a small rise of ground or the shadow of a boulder, and there you sit in silence. This is not the dramatic communion of burning bushes or pillars of fire that people imagine when they think of prophets. This is the patient, often fruitless work of attentiveness. Hours pass in silence. Your mind wanders to practical concerns, the dwindling water supply, the sick goat, the messenger who was supposed to arrive from Jerusalem, but has not come. You gently redirect your attention back to listening, back to the quality of receptive silence that you have learned to cultivate. Sometimes nothing comes. Days, weeks can pass without a word, without a vision, without any sense of divine presence. These are the times that test faith most severely, not the dramatic moments of revelation, but the long stretches of apparent absence, when you wonder if you have imagined it all, if you are simply a deluded wanderer leading others into the wilderness for no purpose at all. But then, perhaps when you least expect it, something shifts. It might begin as a subtle change in the quality of your attention, a deepening of the silence around you. Or it might arrive like thunder, sudden and overwhelming, filling your consciousness with words and images that are clearly not your own. The experience varies, but the essence remains constant. You become aware that you are not alone, that something vast and incomprehensible is seeking to communicate through your limited human understanding. When such moments come, you reach for the tools of your trade, a piece of pottery, smooth and large enough to write upon, a stylus fashioned from reed or bone, sometimes papyrus, if you have been blessed with such luxury. More often, you write on whatever surface presents itself, knowing that the words themselves matter more than their material vessel. Your handwriting is careful, deliberate. These are not your words, and you feel the weight of responsibility to preserve them accurately. You write in Hebrew, the ancient tongue of your people, each letter formed with reverence and precision. The words that flow through you often surprise with their poetry, their layered meanings, their ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously. As the day progresses, the work of prophecy interweaves with the work of living. There are followers to counsel, disputes to mediate, practical decisions to make about where the camp will move next and how the community will sustain itself. You find yourself caught between worlds, the transcendent realm of divine communication and the immediate, pressing needs of human beings trying to survive in a harsh landscape. A young woman approaches with questions about her husband's illness. An old man seeks guidance about a family dispute that has torn his household apart. A teenager wrestles with doubt, wondering if this life of wandering in privation has any meaning. You listen to each concern with patience, knowing that the sacred often manifests most clearly in these ordinary human encounters. The afternoon heat drives everyone into whatever shade can be found. This is a time for rest, for quiet conversation, for the small tasks that keep a nomadic community functioning. Someone mends a tent, another tends to a sick animal. Children play simple games in the sand, their laughter a bright note in the austere landscape. You use this time to review the morning's writings, to pray over them, to consider their meaning and implications. Sometimes the words that came to you in the morning seem obscure or troubling in the harsh light of afternoon. You wrestle with interpretation, with the burden of delivering messages that are often difficult or unwelcome. As evening approaches, the community gathers for the day's most important meal. The fire is built carefully. Fuel is precious here, and every stick of wood or dried dung must be conserved. The flames cast dancing shadows on faces, weathered by sun and wind, creating an intimate circle of warmth and light in the vast darkness. The meal is communal, shared from common vessels. There might be lentil stew, flavored with wild herbs gathered during the day's journey. Flatbread is passed from hand to hand. If fortune has smiled upon the camp, there might be meat a bird trapped during the day, or a small portion from a goat that had to be slaughtered. But more nourishing than the food are the words that are shared around the fire. This is when you speak of what you have received, when the private revelations of the morning become the communal wisdom of the evening. You choose your words carefully, aware that those who listen will carry them into their own prayers, their own understanding, their own lives. The messages you share are rarely comfortable. They speak of justice for the oppressed, of judgment for the corrupt, of radical changes that will upend the established order. They challenge the powerful and comfort the powerless. They call for repentance, for return to ancient covenants, for faithfulness in the face of overwhelming opposition. Some who hear these words nod in understanding and conviction. Others shift uncomfortably, wrestling with implications they would rather not face. A few, over time, will decide that this life is too demanding, too uncertain, and they will slip away in the night, returning to the relative comfort and predictability of settled life. As the fire burns lower and the conversation quiets, you find yourself once again under the vast canopy of stars. The desert night is crisp and clear, so different from the heavy darkness of cities and towns. Here, the boundary between earth and heaven seems permeable, as if the dome of the sky might at any moment part to reveal the mysteries beyond. You make your way back to your simple tent, knowing that tomorrow will bring another day of listening, another opportunity to serve as a bridge between the human and the divine. The ground is hard beneath your sleeping mat, the wool blanket coarse against your skin. But there is a deep satisfaction in this simplicity, this stripping away of all that is unnecessary to focus on what is essential. Before sleep takes you, you offer one final prayer, not for comfort or ease, but for faithfulness, for the courage to speak truth even when it is unwelcome, for the wisdom to distinguish between the voice of the divine and the voice of your own desires and fears, for the strength to continue this strange, demanding life of wandering and waiting and witnessing. The last thing you hear before sleep is the wind moving across the desert, a sound both ancient and eternal, carrying with it the whispers of all who have walked this way before you and all who will come after. In that sound, you find a kind of peace, not the peace of certainty or comfort, but the deeper peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be, doing exactly what you are called to do. And in the morning, you will rise again, and the cycle will continue this patient work of listening, this humble service of speaking, this profound calling to stand at the threshold between worlds and translate the untranslatable for those who hunger to hear. Verse 2. Elijah's flight and fire. In the 9th century before the Common Era, when the northern kingdom of Israel had turned its face toward foreign gods and forgotten the covenant of their ancestors, there lived a man whose very name meant, "My God is Yahweh." Elijah the Tishbite emerged from the wild places of Gilead like a force of nature, itself hair flowing, eyes blazing with conviction, wrapped in the simple garments of one who had chosen the wilderness over the comfort of courts. The land he entered was sick with drought. For 3 years, no rain had fallen, no dew had moistened the earth. Rivers had become memories, wells had turned to dust, and the people suffered under the weight of their king's apostasy. Ahab ruled from his ivory palace in Samaria, while his queen, Jezebel of Sidon, had brought with her the worship of Baal, the storm god, the supposed bringer of rain and fertility. It was into this parched and spiritually barren landscape that Elijah came with his challenge, not whispered in shadowed corners, but proclaimed boldly before the king himself. The drought would continue, he declared, until the people remembered who truly commanded the heavens. No rain would fall except at the word of the God of Israel. But speaking truth to power has always carried a price, and Jezebel's response was swift and merciless. Her soldiers scoured the land, hunting the prophet who dared challenge her imported deities. Elijah fled eastward, across the Jordan, into the wilderness that had always been the refuge of those who walked too close to the divine flame. Picture him now, this weathered man of perhaps 50 years, moving through the harsh landscape east of the Jordan. His feet are hard and calloused from years of walking, his skin bronzed and creased by sun and wind. He carries little a simple staff, a leather waterskin, a small pouch containing a few coins and basic necessities. His clothing is the rough-woven wool of common people, practical and durable, designed for hard travel rather than comfort. The ravens find him by the brook Cherith, as if drawn by some invisible command. Each morning and evening they come, carrying bread and meat in their beaks, an impossible sight that he accepts with the grateful pragmatism of one who has learned not to question the methods of divine provision. The brook provides water, sweet and clear, and for months this strange sanctuary sustains him, while the drought tightens its grip on the land beyond. But even brooks fed by springs eventually surrender to drought this severe. The day comes when Elijah kneels beside the diminishing stream and finds only mud where water once flowed. The ravens still come, but water, the fundamental necessity of life, is gone. In this moment of crisis, guidance comes as it often does, not as a thunderous voice from heaven, but as a quiet inner knowing, a certainty about where he must go next. Zarephath, a Phoenician city north of Israel, in the very heartland of Baal worship. It seems like madness to seek refuge in enemy territory, but Elijah has long since learned that divine logic often appears as human foolishness. He shoulders his few possessions and begins the long journey north, trusting in provisions he cannot see and protection he cannot guarantee. At the gates of Zarephath, he encounters her, a widow gathering sticks, her movements speaking of desperation and resignation. Her clothes are patched and faded, her hands rough from work, her eyes holding the particular weariness of someone who has counted every grain of flour, measured every drop of oil, and knows that the mathematics of survival no longer add up. When Elijah asks for water, she responds with the automatic hospitality of her people, despite her obvious poverty. But when he asks for bread, the truth spills out like water from a broken jar. She has nothing. A handful of flour in a jar, a little oil in a jug enough, perhaps for one last meal for herself and her son, and then they will die. What follows is one of those moments when the miraculous emerges from the mundane, when divine power manifests not in cosmic displays, but in the simple, ongoing miracle of sustenance. Make the bread anyway, Elijah tells her. Feed the stranger first, and trust that provision will follow. It requires extraordinary faith, not just from the prophet, but from this Phoenician widow, who has no reason to trust foreign holy men and their promises. Yet something in Elijah's manner, perhaps the quiet certainty with which he speaks, convinces her to risk everything on an impossible hope. The meal jar does not run empty. The oil jug does not fail. Day after day, week after week, the impossible mathematics of divine provision continues. There is always enough for one more meal, never abundance, but never lack. 3 people live on what should have sustained one for a single day, and somehow it works. For more than a year, Elijah lives in this unlikely sanctuary. He prays with the widow and her son, teaches them about the God of Israel, and watches as their tentative trust grows into genuine faith. It is a time of hidden preparation, of quiet miracles, of learning to see the sacred in the everyday rhythm of shared meals and simple prayers. But the peace of Zarephath cannot last forever. The day comes when the widow's son falls ill, a sudden, severe sickness that resists all remedies. The boy grows weaker, his breathing more labored, until finally he stops breathing altogether. The mother's faith, so carefully nurtured, explodes into bitter accusation. "Have you come to remind me of my sins?" she cries to Elijah. "Have you come to kill my son?" Elijah takes the lifeless child to the upper room where he has been staying. There, alone with death and doubt, he lays the boy on his own bed and cries out to God with a desperation that strips away all pretense of prophetic dignity. 3 times he stretches himself upon the child. 3 times he pleads for life to return. It is raw, honest prayer, not the formal liturgies of temple worship, but the broken cry of a man who has watched hope die in a mother's arms. The boy's breath returns like a whisper, then grows stronger. His eyes open, confused but alive. When Elijah carries him downstairs and places him in his mother's arms, her words become a confession that echoes through the centuries. Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth. But even this miracle of resurrection cannot shield them from the larger drama unfolding in Israel. Word comes that Ahab is searching for Elijah throughout the land, blaming him for the drought that has brought the kingdom to its knees. The time for hiding is over. The confrontation that has been building for 3 years can no longer be delayed. The journey back to Israel is somber. Elijah knows he is walking toward a showdown that will determine not just his own fate, but the spiritual direction of an entire nation. As he crosses back into Israelite territory, he can see the devastation. The drought has wrought withered fields, empty wells, settlements abandoned, as people flee to wherever they hope water might still be found. The meeting with Ahab, when it finally comes, crackles with 3 years of accumulated tension. The king's greeting is an accusation. Is it you, you troubler of Israel? But Elijah throws the charge back with interest. He is not the troubler that honor belongs to the royal house that has abandoned the commandments of their ancestors and chosen to follow the Baals. The challenge, when Elijah issues it, is breathtaking in its audacity. Let all Israel gather on Mount Carmel. Let the prophets of Baal come, all 450 of them. Let the prophets of Asherah join them, another 400. And let there be a test to determine once and for all which deity truly commands the forces of nature. Mount Carmel, a place of ancient sanctity, where the sea breezes meet the inland winds, where altars have stood since time immemorial. On its heights, with all Israel watching, the greatest theological drama of the age is about to unfold. They come in their thousands, curious, desperate, drawn by rumors of the confrontation to come. The prophets of Baal arrive in their ceremonial robes, confident in their numbers and their elaborate rituals. Ahab comes with his court, perhaps hoping that his imported gods will finally vindicate his policies. And Elijah stands alone, one man facing 450, armed with nothing but unshakable conviction. The terms of the contest are simple. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, 2 prayers. Whichever deity sends fire from heaven to consume the offering will be acknowledged as the true God. The people murmur their agreement. Even Ahab cannot object to such clear terms. The prophets of Baal go first. They build their altar with meticulous care, arrange their sacrifice with ceremonial precision, and begin their invocations. From morning until noon they call upon their God, dancing around the altar with increasing frenzy, chanting the ancient formulas that have worked in Phoenician temples. Nothing happens. As the sun climbs higher, their desperation grows. They leap upon their altar, crying louder, their movements becoming more frantic. Elijah watches with grim patience, and then begins to mock them with savage irony. Call louder, he suggests. Perhaps your God is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Perhaps he is sleeping and needs to be awakened. Stung by his ridicule, the prophets of Baal escalate their ritual to self-mutilation, cutting themselves with swords and lances until blood flows freely. Their cries echo across the mountainside as the afternoon wears on, but the sky remains silent, the sacrifice unchanged. When evening approaches and the prophets of Baal finally collapse in exhaustion and defeat, Elijah steps forward. His movements are deliberate, unhurried. This is not theater, this is worship, carried out with the careful reverence of one who knows he stands in the presence of the holy. He rebuilds the ancient altar of the Lord that had been torn down, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. He arranges the wood, prepares the sacrifice, and then does something that makes the watching crowd gasp in astonishment. He orders water to be poured over everything not once, but 3 times, until the sacrifice is soaked. The wood is drenched, and water fills the trench he has dug around the altar. Water. In the midst of a 3-year drought, he pours out precious water as if it were abundant. It is either supreme confidence or supreme madness, and perhaps they are the same thing. When Elijah finally prays, his words are simple, direct, devoid of theatrical excess. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. The fire falls like lightning, but more intense, more focused. It consumes not just the sacrifice, but the wood, the stones, the dust, even the water in the trench. The heat is so intense that those nearest the altar stagger backward, shielding their faces. When the flames die away, nothing remains but scorched earth. The silence that follows is profound, pregnant with the weight of divine manifestation. Then, like a wave breaking, the entire multitude falls prostrate, crying out with one voice, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The people's response is swift and terrible. The prophets of Baal, so confident hours before, are seized and dragged down to the brook Kishon. There, in accordance with the ancient law that demanded death for those who led Israel astray, they are executed. It is brutal justice, but Elijah sees it as necessary. The spiritual cancer that has infected the nation must be cut out completely. As the last of the false prophets dies, Elijah turns to Ahab with words that seem impossible after 3 years of drought. "Go up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing of rain." The king can hear nothing but wind, but Elijah's spiritual senses detect the approach of the storm that will end the drought. On the summit of Carmel, Elijah bows down with his face between his knees and prays with the intensity of one who knows the critical moment has arrived. He sends his servant to look toward the sea, again and again, until finally the young man reports a cloud no bigger than a man's hand rising from the western horizon. That tiny cloud grows with supernatural speed, darkening the sky, gathering the moisture that has been withheld for 3 long years. The wind rises, carrying with it the scent of rain, the promise of renewal. Elijah tells Ahab to harness his chariot and flee to Jezreel before the storm makes travel impossible. And then the rain comes. Not the gentle showers of normal weather, but a deluge, a cosmic outpouring that transforms the parched landscape within hours. Streams that have been dry for years suddenly run full. The earth, hard as stone from drought, begins to soften and bloom. In this moment of triumph, something extraordinary happens. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Elijah with such power that he runs before Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel, a distance of perhaps 20 miles, arriving before the king, despite having started after him. It should be the moment of ultimate vindication, the crown of his prophetic career. The people have seen the power of God demonstrated beyond doubt. The drought is broken. The false prophets are dead. Surely now Israel will return to the covenant of their fathers. But triumph has a way of turning to ashes with shocking swiftness. When Jezebel learns what has happened on Mount Carmel, her response is not repentance but rage. She sends a message to Elijah that chills his blood. "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." The man who faced down 450 prophets, who called fire from heaven, who ended a 3-year drought, suddenly finds himself paralyzed by fear. Not the clean fear of facing overwhelming odds in service of truth, but something darker, the fear of a man who realizes that even miraculous victories cannot change hearts that are determined to remain closed. He flees south, running from Jezreel toward the desert, driven by terror and a crushing sense of failure. All his mighty works, all the signs and wonders, and still the Queen of Israel threatens his life with impunity. Still the people's conversion seems shallow, temporary, dependent on spectacle rather than genuine transformation. A day's journey into the wilderness, Elijah collapses under a solitary broom tree. The euphoria of Carmel has completely evaporated, replaced by a despair so profound that he prays for death. "It is enough," he cries out to God. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Here is the paradox of the prophetic calling laid bare: to be granted supernatural power, and yet remain achingly human, to work miracles, and yet be subject to the same fears and discouragements that plague ordinary mortals. Elijah sleeps under his tree like a broken man, and perhaps in that moment he is exactly that. But even in his despair, or perhaps especially in his despair, he is not abandoned. An angel touches him as he sleeps, and beside his head appears a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. "Arise and eat," the angel says gently, "because the journey is too great for you." Twice this happens, the angel providing food, Elijah eating and sleeping. The careful restoration of a servant who has given everything can found himself empty. When he finally rises and continues his journey, he travels 40 days and 40 nights on the strength of that miraculous meal, walking south through the wilderness toward the mountain where his spiritual ancestors first encountered the living God. Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai, the place where Moses received the law, where the covenant was forged in fire and thunder. If anywhere can provide answers to the questions that torment Elijah's soul, it will be here, at the source, at the foundational meeting place between heaven and earth. The cave where Elijah takes shelter may be the same cleft in the rock where Moses hid when the glory of God passed by. Here, in this place saturated with sacred history, the word of the Lord comes to him, not in accusation for his flight, not in disappointment at his despair, but with a simple question that cuts to the heart of everything. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" His answer pours out like water. From a broken dam, his zeal for the Lord, his loneliness, his sense that he alone remains faithful, while all Israel has forsaken the covenant. He has done everything right, followed every command, demonstrated God's power beyond doubt, and yet here he sits in a cave, fleeing for his life from a pagan queen. The response comes not in words, but in manifestation. First, a wind so powerful it splits mountains and breaks rocks. But the Lord is not in the wind. Then an earthquake that shakes the very foundations of the mountain. But the Lord is not in the earthquake. Then fire, reminiscent of Carmel, but far more intense, consuming everything in its path. But the Lord is not in the fire. And after the fire, silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper than sound, more fundamental than noise. In Hebrew, it is called Kol Demama Daka, a thin whisper of silence, a voice that speaks without words, a presence that fills emptiness rather than displacing it. When Elijah hears this voice that is not a voice, he knows he is in the presence of the mystery that transcends all earthly categories. He covers his face with his mantle and stands at the mouth of the cave, not because he has been commanded to do so, but because every fiber of his being recognizes that he stands at the threshold of the ineffable. The question comes again, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And this time, though he gives the same answer, something has changed. The despair is still there, the sense of failure and isolation, but now it exists within a larger context, the context of a presence that is not dependent on success or failure, victory or defeat, but simply is. The Lord's response reshapes everything. Elijah is not the last faithful one. There are 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. His work is not finished. There are kings to anoint, a successor to train, a future to prepare, for even if he will not see its fulfillment. His despair, real as it is, exists within a story larger than his own understanding. Return the way you came, God tells him. Go to Damascus, anoint Hazael as king over Syria, anoint Jehu as king over Israel, and anoint Elisha to be prophet in your place. The work will continue, with or without him, but it will continue. It is not the answer Elijah expected, but it is the answer he needed. Not vindication, but mission. Not explanation, but trust. Not the removal of difficulty, but the assurance that difficulty serves a purpose beyond his comprehension. The journey back from Horeb is different from the journey there. Elijah travels with purpose now, not fleeing from something, but moving toward something. He finds Elisha plowing in his father's field with 12 yoke of oxen, a young man of substance and skill, ready to leave everything behind when the prophet's mantle falls upon his shoulders. The transition is both sudden and ceremonial. Elisha slaughters his oxen, burns his plow as fuel for the fire, and distributes the meat to his community, a feast that marks the end of one life and the beginning of another. When the meal is finished, he rises and follows Elijah, leaving behind family, property, security, everything except the calling that has suddenly and irrevocably claimed his life. For several years they travel together, master and disciple, the old prophet gradually passing on not just knowledge but wisdom, not just techniques but understanding. Elisha learns to see with prophetic eyes, to hear the divine voice amid the cacophony of human voices, to carry the terrible and wonderful burden of speaking for God to a people who rarely want to hear what God has to say. The end comes suddenly, though both men somehow know it is coming. They travel together to Bethel, to Jericho, to the Jordan, visiting the schools of prophets, saying farewells that everyone understands, but no one speaks aloud. At each stop, the young prophets ask Elisha if he knows that his master will be taken from him that day. And each time he answers, "Yes, I know." Keep silence. At the Jordan, Elijah takes his mantle, the rough garment that has become the symbol of his calling, and strikes the water with it. The river parts, allowing them to cross on dry ground, a sign that echoes the great deliverances of Israel's past and hints at the greater deliverance to come. On the far side, Elijah asks what Elisha wants from him before he is taken away. The request that comes surprises with its boldness. "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." Not wealth, not fame, not ease, but the spiritual inheritance of the firstborn, the double portion that belongs to the primary heir. Elijah's response reveals the mystery at the heart of prophetic calling. Such gifts are not his to give. "You have asked a hard thing," he says. "Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." They walk on together, talking as they go, two men sharing their last moments of earthly companionship. And then, suddenly, the air fills with the sound of hoofbeats and the rumble of wheels. A chariot of fire drawn by horses of fire appears between them, separating master from disciple for the last time. Elijah is caught up in a whirlwind, lifted from the earth, carried away toward heaven, while his mantle falls to the ground where Elisha stands watching. The young prophet cries out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." Recognizing that Israel has lost more than a prophet, they have lost their spiritual defense, their connection to the divine warrior who fights for his people. When the whirlwind passes and the sky clears, Elisha stands alone beside the Jordan. He picks up the fallen mantle, this simple garment that now carries the weight of spiritual authority, and strikes the water as he had seen his master do. Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah? He calls out, and the waters part again, confirming that the spirit of Elijah rests indeed upon his successor. But the story of Elijah does not end with his ascension. His influence echoes through the centuries. His memory becomes a promise of return. His uncompromising faithfulness, a standard against which all subsequent prophets are measured. In Jewish tradition, a place is set for him at every Passover table, for he is the one who will herald the coming of the Messiah. In Christian understanding, he appears with Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration, representing the prophets, while Moses represents the law. The man who fled in terror from Jezebel's threats becomes the symbol of prophetic courage. The one who despaired under the broom tree becomes the promise that faithful service is never forgotten. The voice that called fire from heaven continues to speak, reminding every generation that there are still choices to be made, still altars to be rebuilt, still hearts waiting to be turned back to the living God. In the end, Perhaps this is Elijah's greatest miracle, not the fire from heaven, or the resurrection of the dead, or even his own ascension, but the demonstration that ordinary human beings can become extraordinary through faithful response to divine calling. That fear and faith can coexist in the same heart. That failure and victory are often separated by the thinnest of margins. That the still, small voice of God speaks most clearly to those who have learned to listen in the silence that follows the storm. Verse 3, the scrolls of judgment, how prophetic texts were recorded and preserved in a small chamber in Jerusalem. Perhaps in the shadow of the temple itself, a scribe sits hunched over his writing table as the afternoon light filters through a narrow window. His name is Baruch, son of Neriah, and his fingers are stained with the black ink that has become his life's work. Before him lies a scroll of papyrus, its surface cream-colored and smooth, prepared with the care that befits the sacred words it will soon contain. Across from him sits another man, older, his eyes holding the weight of visions too heavy for one soul to bear alone. This is Jeremiah the prophet, and he is dictating words that will outlive empires, survive the destruction of cities, and speak to hearts not yet born when these syllables first fall from his lips. The word of the Lord came to me. Jeremiah begins, his voice measured and careful. He has learned that every word matters, that the difference between shall and may can determine how. Future generations understand the nature of divine promise and threat. Baruch writes quickly but precisely, his reed pen moving across the papyrus in the flowing script that marks a professional scribe. This scene, repeated countless times across centuries, represents one of history's most remarkable preservations, a transformation of ephemeral spoken words into permanent written texts that would survive conquests, exiles, persecutions, and the simple erosion of time. The process by which the words of Israel's prophets became the scrolls we know today is a story of human ingenuity in service of divine revelation, of ordinary people taking extraordinary care to preserve what they believe to be the very words of God. The materials themselves tell a story of international commerce and technological innovation. The papyrus beneath Baruch's pen was harvested from reeds growing in the Nile Delta, processed in Egyptian workshops, and transported by Phoenician merchants across the Mediterranean and up the Jordan Valley to Jerusalem's markets. Each sheet represents not just writing material, but a complex network of trade relationships that connected the ancient world. For the most precious texts, scribes sometimes used parchment made from carefully prepared animal skins, sheep, goats, or calves whose hides had been soaked in lime water, scraped clean of hair and flesh, stretched on frames, and rubbed smooth with pumice stones. The result was a writing surface more durable than papyrus, though far more expensive. A single large parchment scroll might cost a skilled craftsman's wages for several months. The ink flowing from Baruch's pen is itself a small miracle of ancient chemistry. Made from lampblack the soot collected from oil lamps, mixed with gum arabic from acacia trees, and thinned with water, it creates letters that will remain legible for millennia if properly stored. Some scribes add iron compounds to darken the color or wine vinegar to prevent the ink from running. The most valued inks incorporate powdered gold or silver for texts of particular significance. But it is not just the materials that matter. It is the human dimension of this preservation process. Behind every prophetic scroll lies a relationship between the one who speaks and the one who writes, a partnership that shapes not just the preservation of words, but their very formation. Watch Baruch as he pauses in his writing, his pen hovering over the papyrus. A question has arisen. Did Jeremiah mean to say, the nations or all nations? The difference is small, but significant, affecting how readers will understand the scope of God's judgment. Jeremiah considers carefully, perhaps closing his eyes, to recall the exact phrasing of the vision that came to him weeks earlier. This is the delicate dance between prophet and scribe, not mere dictation, but collaboration in the truest sense. The prophet must translate the overwhelming experience of divine encounter into human language, while the scribe must capture not just words but meaning, preserving the substance while navigating the limitations of written communication. Sometimes the process is straightforward. The prophet speaks, the scribe writes. The text flows smoothly from inspiration to inscription. But more often, it involves lengthy consultation, revision, and refinement. A single oracle might be dictated, discussed, revised, and rewritten multiple times before both prophet and scribe are satisfied that the written word accurately represents the received revelation. Consider the physical act of writing itself. Hebrew scribes write from right to left, their hands moving across the page in a rhythm that becomes second nature after years of practice. The letters are formed with careful attention to proportion and spacing. Too cramped, and the text becomes difficult to read. Too loose and precious writing material is wasted. Each letter must be clear enough to distinguish from similar characters, for a single misread letter can change the meaning of an entire passage. The scribe works without the luxury of punctuation as we know it. Ancient Hebrew is written in a continuous stream of consonants, with vowel sounds implied rather than marked. Later generations will develop systems of dots and dashes to indicate proper pronunciation. But in Barek's time, the reader must supply the vowels from context and tradition. This places enormous responsibility on the scribe to ensure that word divisions and sentence structures are clear from the surrounding text. As afternoon fades into evening, oil lamps are lit to extend the working hours. The flickering light creates dancing shadows on the scroll, and the scribe must adjust his position frequently to avoid eye strain. This is patient, methodical work that cannot be rushed without introducing errors. A single session might produce only a few columns of text, depending on the complexity of the material and the care required for accuracy. The scroll grows slowly, column by column. Ancient scrolls are written in columns, typically 3 to 4 inches wide, with margins between columns to prevent the text from running together when the scroll is rolled. The scribe must plan carefully, calculating how much text will fit on the available material and adjusting his script size accordingly. Running out of papyrus or parchment before completing the text would be both expensive and problematic. But the preservation process extends far beyond the initial writing. Once a prophetic text is complete, it must be copied and recopied to ensure its survival. This creates a complex network of textual transmission that stretches across centuries and continents. In Jerusalem's temple, professional scribes maintain archives of prophetic writings, creating multiple copies of each text and storing them in different locations to protect against fire, theft, or political upheaval. The most important scrolls are kept in cedar chests, treated with aromatic oils that repel insects, wrapped in linen cloths that protect against moisture and dust. The scribal schools that emerge around these archives develop increasingly sophisticated methods for ensuring textual accuracy. Scribes count not just words but individual letters, noting any irregularities or corrections. They develop systems of marginalia notes written in the margins or between lines to preserve variant readings, explain difficult passages, or record corrections to copying errors. Master scribes train apprentices in the sacred art of textual preservation, passing down not just techniques of writing, but traditions of interpretation. A young scribe learning to copy Isaiah must understand not just how to form the letters, but what the text means, how different passages relate to each other, and where scribal errors are most likely to occur. The process becomes even more complex when prophetic texts must be translated into other languages. As Jewish communities spread across the Mediterranean world, the demand grows for Greek versions of Hebrew scriptures. The task of translation requires not just linguistic skill, but deep theological understanding, for the translator must navigate differences not just in vocabulary, but in worldview. Watch as a scholar in Alexandria works on a Greek version of Ezekiel. The Hebrew text speaks of God's kavod, often translated as glory, but carrying connotations of weight, substance, divine presence that have no exact Greek equivalent. The translator must choose doxa, time, or perhaps a longer phrase that attempts to capture the full meaning. Each choice shapes how Greek-speaking readers will understand the nature of divine revelation. The preservation process faces constant threats. Political upheavals can scatter scribal communities, forcing them to hide or transport their precious manuscripts under dangerous conditions. The Babylonian exile of 586 BCE creates a crisis in textual preservation, as Jerusalem's archives are destroyed and scholars are forced to reconstruct prophetic texts from memory and scattered copies. Fire poses perhaps the greatest threat to ancient libraries. Scrolls stored too close together can fuel conflagrations that destroy centuries of careful work in a matter of hours. Water damage from floods or leaking roofs can make papyrus illegible or cause parchment to rot. Even the natural aging process gradually weakens writing materials, making ancient texts increasingly fragile with each passing year. Yet somehow, against all odds, the words survive. When the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by Roman armies in 70 CE, Jewish scholars have already distributed copies of prophetic texts throughout the Mediterranean world. What cannot be preserved in stone and cedar is carried in the minds and hearts of teachers who have memorized entire books of prophecy. The development of new writing technologies gradually transforms the preservation process. The invention of parchment codices-bound books, rather than scrolls, makes texts easier to consult and more compact to store. Later, the introduction of paper manufacturing techniques, learned from Chinese prisoners of war, revolutionizes book production, making writing materials more affordable and accessible. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of prophetic preservation is its human dimension. Behind every surviving text lies a chain of individuals who believed these words were worth preserving, often at great personal cost. Scribes who spent their lives hunched over writing tables, developing failing eyesight and arthritic hands in service of textual accuracy. Scholars who fled persecution, carrying precious manuscripts. Teachers who devoted years to memorizing texts so they could reconstruct them if the written copies were lost. In hidden caves near the Dead Sea, a community of religious separatists carefully copies and preserves prophetic texts, wrapping them in linen and storing them in clay jars designed to protect against moisture and decay. They cannot know that their meticulous work will be discovered 2,000 years later by Bedouin shepherds, providing modern scholars with manuscripts far older than any previously known. The preservation process also involves active interpretation and adaptation. Scribes do not merely copy texts mechanically. They engage with them intellectually and spiritually, sometimes adding explanatory notes that help readers understand obscure references or difficult passages. These additions, while not part of the original prophetic utterance, become part of the textual tradition, shaping how future generations will read and understand these ancient words. Consider how the scribe handles a prophecy of Jeremiah that refers to specific political events of the 7th century BCE. Writing for readers who will live centuries later, he might add marginal notes explaining who the Babylonian king was, what the siege of Jerusalem involved, or how particular Hebrew terms should be understood. These glosses become part of the text's history, even as they remain distinct from the prophet's original words. The emergence of synagogue worship after the Babylonian exile creates new demands for prophetic texts. No longer confined to temple archives, these writings must be forwarded for public reading, with clear divisions and performance notes. Scribes develop systems for marking where readers should pause, which passages should be chanted rather than spoken, and how different voices and dialogue should be distinguished. This liturgical use of prophetic texts adds another layer to their preservation. Communities that read Isaiah or Jeremiah regularly in worship are more likely to notice and correct scribal errors. The texts become embedded in communal memory through repeated hearing, creating multiple safeguards against textual corruption. As centuries pass, the preservation process becomes increasingly systematic. Masoretic scholars develop elaborate systems for ensuring textual accuracy, counting words, letters, even the occurrence of specific letter combinations. They create what amounts to statistical profiles of each biblical book, making it possible to detect even minor copying errors. These Masoretes, working primarily between the 6th and 10th centuries CE, represent the culmination of ancient preservation techniques. They develop standardized texts, complete with vowel points and accent marks, that become the foundation for all subsequent scholarship. Their work represents not just technical achievement, but spiritual devotion. The conviction that every letter of prophetic text carries significance and deserves careful preservation. The medieval period brings new challenges and opportunities for textual preservation. Islamic conquests create new centers of learning where Jewish and Christian scholars work alongside Muslim intellectuals to preserve and translate ancient texts. The invention of printing in the 15th century revolutionizes textual reproduction, making it possible to create multiple identical copies of prophetic books. Yet even in the age of mechanical reproduction, the human element remains central to preservation. Editors must still choose between variant readings. Translators must still navigate linguistic and cultural differences. And scholars must still interpret texts whose original contexts are separated from modern readers by millennia of history. The discovery of ancient manuscripts in monasteries, caves, and archive collections continues to refine our understanding of how prophetic texts were preserved. Each new find adds pieces to the puzzle of textual transmission, revealing the complex processes by which ancient words survived the collapse of empires and the transformation of civilizations. In a monastery library in the Sinai Peninsula, a scholar carefully photographs pages of a 4th century codex containing prophetic texts. The parchment is brown with age, the ink faded but still legible. Each page represents not just ancient words, but the accumulated labor of countless individuals who believed these texts were worth preserving against all odds. The preservation of prophetic texts ultimately represents one of humanity's great collaborative achievements. Across cultures, languages, and centuries, individuals have devoted their lives to ensuring that words spoken in ancient Palestine would remain accessible to readers they would never meet. The process required not just technical skill, but profound faith that these words carry truth worth preserving, meaning worth transmitting, and power worth protecting. Today, when we open a book of prophetic literature, we hold in our hands the culmination of this remarkable preservation process. The words of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the other prophets reach us through an unbroken chain of human dedication that stretches back nearly 3 millennia. Behind every verse lies the careful work of scribes like Baruch, the devotion of scholars like the Masoretes, and the faith of countless individuals who believed that the word of the Lord, once spoken, deserves to endure forever. In the end, the scrolls themselves are temporary papyrus crumbles, parchment decays, even stone inscriptions weather away. But the words they preserve transcend their material vessels, passed from generation to generation, translated into new languages, adapted to new contexts, yet somehow retaining their essential power to challenge, comfort, and transform those who encounter them. The true miracle of prophetic preservation lies not in the survival of ancient manuscripts, though that is remarkable enough, but in the survival of the words themselves, their capacity to speak across the centuries with undiminished force, their ability to find new meaning in each generation, while retaining their essential message. In preserving the scrolls of judgment, humanity has preserved something far more precious than historical artifacts. It has preserved the living word that continues to call each generation to account before the eternal. Verse 4. Kings and skeptics prophets from the royal court's view in the royal palace at Samaria. King Ahab sits upon his ivory throne, surrounded by the trappings of earthly power. The walls around him are inlaid with precious stones and exotic woods, testament to Israel's prosperity under his rule. Courtiers in fine linen move through the corridors with the practiced grace of those who have learned to navigate the dangerous currents of royal favor. Outside, the kingdom flourishes with trade, military success, and the kind of stability that comes from strong leadership and strategic alliances. Yet today, like so many days before, the king's mood is troubled. Word has come that the wild man from Gilead is back, Elijah the Tishbite, that perpetual thorn in the royal side, that voice of ancient superstitions and inconvenient moral demands. The very mention of his name casts a shadow over the court's carefully cultivated atmosphere of confidence and control. To understand the relationship between prophets and kings in ancient Israel, we must step into the sandals of those who ruled, who bore the weight of political responsibility, who faced the impossible task of governing a small nation caught between the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. From their perspective, the story of prophecy looks very different than it does from the desert camps and humble dwellings where the prophets themselves lived and taught. Picture the royal council chamber as advisors gather around their king. These are practical military commanders who understand the realities of warfare, economic ministers who grasp the complexities of international trade, diplomatic envoys who have walked the halls of power in Damascus, Tyre, and even distant Babylon. They serve a monarchy that exists not in the realm of theological abstraction, but in the harsh world of geopolitical necessity. To these advisors, prophets often appear as dangerous idealists, men who would sacrifice political stability for the sake of religious purity. When Elijah demands that Israel worship only the Lord God and abandon all foreign alliances that might require diplomatic accommodation to other deities, he sounds to royal ears like someone who fundamentally misunderstands how nations survive in the ancient world. Consider Ahab's position. He has married Jezebel of Sidon, not out of romantic love, but as part of a carefully negotiated treaty that secures Israel's northern border and opens profitable trade routes with the Phoenician city-states. These coastal kingdoms are master merchants and shipbuilders, their cedar wood and purple dye coveted throughout the known world. Alliance with them brings prosperity to Israel's people, fuller granaries, busier markets, and the kind of economic security that makes possible the construction of cities, temples, and public works. But such alliances come with religious obligations. When a king marries a foreign princess, her gods must be welcomed and honored alongside the national deity. To do otherwise would be seen as a grave insult to the allied nation, potentially voiding treaties and inviting military retaliation. From the court's perspective, maintaining shrines to Baal and Asherah is not apostasy, it is diplomacy, the price of peace and prosperity in a dangerous world. The royal scribes who record the official history of Ahab's reign paint a very different picture than the one preserved in prophetic literature. In their chronicles, he appears as a successful military commander who fortified cities, expanded trade, and brought unprecedented wealth to the northern kingdom. The great ivory palace at Samaria, the fortified cities of Megiddo and Hazor, the increased population and agricultural production. All these testify to effective governance that improved the lives of ordinary Israelites. When prophets appear in these official accounts, they are often portrayed as sources of instability and public unrest. Elijah's challenge on Mount Carmel, so dramatic and decisive from the prophetic perspective, looks from the royal viewpoint like a dangerous religious spectacle that could have precipitated civil war. The execution of 450 priests of Baal represents not just religious purification, but a diplomatic catastrophe that potentially threatens Israel's alliance with Phoenicia and other neighboring powers. The court's skepticism toward prophetic claims often has practical foundations. Kings deal daily with individuals who claim divine inspiration for their own political agendas. Palace hallways echo with the voices of petitioners who invoke God's name to support their requests for tax relief, military intervention, or judicial decisions in their favor. Royal advisors develop keen sensitivity to the difference between genuine spiritual insight and self-serving manipulation disguised as religious revelation. Moreover, the kings of Israel and Judah operate within a complex web of international relationships that prophets, focused on theological purity, often fail to fully appreciate. When Isaiah advises King Hezekiah to trust in the Lord rather than seeking military alliance with Egypt against the Assyrian threat, his counsel sounds spiritually admirable, but politically naive to those who understand the brutal realities of ancient warfare. From the royal perspective, prophets often seem to live in a world of theological abstractions, while kings must navigate concrete political realities. A prophet can speak of trusting in divine protection, but a king must consider siege engines, troop movements, and the logistics of feeding a city under assault. A prophet can condemn social injustice in sweeping moral terms, but a king must balance competing interests, limited resources, and the practical challenges of governing a diverse population with conflicting needs and desires. Attention becomes particularly acute during times of international crisis, when the great empires of Assyria or Babylon threaten Israel's independence. Prophets typically counsel radical trust in divine intervention, while royal advisors recommend more conventional diplomatic and military responses. From the court's viewpoint, prophetic advice often seems to ignore the very real consequences of political miscalculation: the destruction of cities, the deportation of populations, the complete elimination of national independence. Yet the relationship between kings and prophets is more complex than simple opposition between political pragmatism and religious idealism. Many monarchs genuinely respect prophetic voices, even when they find their messages challenging or inconvenient. King David's response to Nathan's confrontation over the Bathsheba affair demonstrates a ruler who accepts prophetic authority even when it condemns his own behavior. Similarly, Josiah's reforms show a king actively collaborating with prophetic vision to reshape the religious and social life of his kingdom. The court's perspective on prophecy is also shaped by the phenomenon of professional prophets individuals who serve as official advisors to the royal household. These court prophets, often organized into guilds or schools, provide a different model of prophetic ministry than the isolated wilderness figures like Elijah or Jeremiah. They dress in court attire rather than rough clothing, live in comfortable quarters rather than caves or tents, and often tell kings what they want to hear rather than challenging royal policies. From the royal viewpoint, these professional prophets serve important functions. They provide spiritual legitimacy for royal decisions, offer divine sanction for military campaigns, and help maintain public confidence in royal leadership. When King Ahab consults 400 prophets before his final battle at Ramoth-Gilead, he is following established protocol for seeking divine guidance before major military undertakings. The presence of professional prophets in the royal court creates an interesting dynamic when independent prophetic voices challenge royal policies. Kings can point to their own religious advisors as evidence that they take divine guidance seriously, while questioning the credentials and motivations of outside critics. When Micaiah son of Imlah contradicts the unanimous prophecy of Ahab's court prophets, the king's skepticism seems reasonable from a purely administrative perspective. Why should one voice outweigh 400? Court officials often view independent prophets with suspicion, not just because of their challenging messages, but because of their potential to destabilize public order. Jeremiah's prophecies of Jerusalem's destruction, delivered during the final siege by Babylonian forces, strike royal ears as seditious propaganda that undermines military morale and civilian resistance. From the perspective of those trying to organize the city's defense, such prophecies serve enemy interests regardless of their claimed divine origin. The social and economic implications of prophetic messages also create tension with royal policy. When prophets condemn exploitation of the poor and call for economic justice, they challenge systems that generate the tax revenue necessary for national defense, public works, and international diplomacy. Kings must balance moral ideals against fiscal realities, often concluding that prophetic social programs, however ethically appealing, are politically and economically unworkable. Royal skepticism toward prophecy sometimes reflects broader questions about the nature of divine communication itself. Kings who have experienced the isolation and burden of ultimate responsibility may wonder whether God really speaks as directly and specifically as prophets claim. The weight of making decisions that affect thousands or millions of lives can generate a kind of existential humility that questions all claims to certain knowledge of divine will. Yet perhaps the most poignant aspect of the royal perspective on prophecy is the loneliness it reveals. Kings surrounded by courtiers and advisors often find themselves isolated by the very nature of their position. Everyone who approaches them wants something: favor, protection, resources, decisions. In this context, prophetic voices, however challenging, sometimes represent the only communication that seeks nothing for the speaker and offers uncomfortable truth rather than comfortable flattery. King David's relationship with Nathan illustrates this complex dynamic. The prophet's willingness to confront royal sin, even at personal risk, paradoxically makes him more trustworthy than advisors whose positions depend on royal favor. From David's perspective, Nathan's courage in delivering unwelcome messages validates his claim to speak for God rather than for personal advantage. The court's view of prophecy is also shaped by the practical question of verification. How can a king distinguish between authentic divine revelation and the self-serving claims of ambitious individuals? Prophets offer signs and fulfillment of predictions as evidence of their authority. But from the royal perspective, such validation often comes too late to be useful for immediate decision-making. Moreover, the cryptic and symbolic nature of much prophetic communication creates interpretive challenges for those who must make concrete policy decisions. When Ezekiel acts out the siege of Jerusalem using a clay tablet and iron pan, the symbolic meaning may be clear, but the practical implications for military planning and diplomatic strategy remain ambiguous. Kings need specific guidance for specific situations, while prophets often speak in universal principles that require interpretation and application. The relationship between royal power and prophetic authority reflects deeper tensions in ancient Israelite society about the nature of leadership and the source of political legitimacy. The monarchy itself represents a relatively late development in Israel's history, grafted onto older traditions of charismatic leadership and direct divine guidance. Prophets often embody these earlier traditions, challenging royal authority not just on specific policies, but on fundamental questions about who has the right to speak for God and govern God's people. From the royal perspective, this challenge cuts to the heart of governmental authority. If prophets can claim direct divine communication that supersedes royal decisions, what becomes of the orderly governance necessary for national survival? The court's skepticism toward prophetic claims often reflects not hostility to religion, but concern for the practical stability that makes civilized life possible. Yet the historical record suggests that many kings found prophetic voices genuinely valuable, even when they disagreed with specific messages. The continued presence of prophets in royal courts, the preservation of their oracles in official records, and the evident respect accorded to figures like Samuel, Elijah, and Isaiah all suggest that monarchs recognized something authentic and important in prophetic ministry, even when it complicated their political calculations. The court's perspective on prophecy ultimately reveals the eternal tension between idealism and pragmatism, between moral vision and political necessity, between the demands of the transcendent and the requirements of the immediate. Kings who dismiss prophetic voices entirely risk losing touch with the moral foundations that legitimate their authority. But kings who follow prophetic counsel without regard for practical consequences risk the destruction of the very institutions they are sworn to protect. Perhaps the wisest monarchs were those who learned to hold this tension creatively, neither rejecting prophetic insight as impractical nor accepting it uncritically as political guidance. King Hezekiah's response to Isaiah's ministry illustrates this balance, taking prophetic warnings seriously enough to implement religious reforms while also pursuing conventional diplomatic and military preparations for the Assyrian threat. The royal perspective on prophecy reminds us that even divine truth must be lived out in the complex realities of human society, where good intentions can have tragic consequences and moral compromises may sometimes serve larger goods. Kings bore the burden of translating eternal principles into temporal policies, of balancing competing claims and limited resources, of making decisions whose consequences would extend far beyond their own reigns. In the end, the tension between kings and prophets may reflect not fundamental opposition, but complementary roles in the divine economy. Prophets preserved and proclaimed the moral vision that gave meaning to political authority, while kings struggled to embody that vision within the constraints of historical circumstance. Neither could fulfill their calling without the other. Prophets needed kings to implement their social vision, while kings needed prophets to remind them of the transcendent purposes their power was meant to serve. As night falls over the palace at Samaria, King Ahab dismisses his counselors and retires to his private chambers. The day's decisions weigh heavily upon him: treaties to be honored, armies to be equipped, taxes to be collected, justice to be administered. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the palace walls, he knows that Elijah may be speaking new words of challenge and judgment to those who gather around desert fires. The king cannot escape the prophet's voice, any more than the prophet can escape the king's authority. They are bound together in the complex dance of power and conscience, authority and accountability that shapes the destiny of nations and the lives of those they serve. In their tension lies perhaps the best hope for governance that serves both human needs and divine purposes. Fallible mortals struggling to embody perfect justice in an imperfect world. And in that struggle, both king and prophet discover their ultimate dependence on the God they serve in such different ways, the Lord who raises up both thrones and prophetic voices, who works through palace intrigue and wilderness visions, who somehow weaves together the threads of human choice and divine purpose into a tapestry too complex for any single perspective to comprehend fully. Conclusion. We have walked tonight through the windswept world of ancient prophecy, feeling the dust of nomadic camps beneath our feet, witnessing the fire that fell from heaven, marveling at the patient scribes who preserved sacred words for generations yet unborn, and glimpsing the complex tensions that existed between those who claimed to speak for God and those who bore the weight of earthly authority. In these layered stories of daily survival and divine encounter, of dramatic confrontation and quiet preservation, of meticulous scholarship and political calculation, we find reflections of our own spiritual journey. We too must learn to listen in the silence between the thunder. We too must find ways to preserve and share what matters most. We too must navigate the tension between idealistic vision and practical necessity. The prophets of ancient Israel speak across the centuries, not because their world was simpler than ours, but because their struggles were fundamentally the same as ours: the challenge of hearing the divine voice amid the cacophony of human voices, the difficulty of speaking truth in times when lies seem more convenient, the burden of carrying messages that comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Perhaps what strikes us most deeply about these ancient figures is their humanity. They were not plaster saints or mythical heroes, but flesh and blood people who experienced doubt and fear, who fled from threats and struggled with depression, who needed food and water and companionship just as we do. Yet through their very humanity, something transcendent found expression: words that have outlasted empires, visions that still challenge and inspire, voices that continue to call each generation to account before the eternal. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of ancient prophets. If this exploration has stirred something in your own spirit, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. What aspect of the prophetic calling speaks most powerfully to you? What questions does it raise about your own response to the divine voice? And what other corners of faith and history would you like us to explore together? Until our paths cross again in these restful histories, may you find your own quiet spaces for listening, your own courage for speaking truth, and your own ways of preserving what is most precious in this brief and beautiful gift of life. The voice that called to the prophets in the wilderness still whispers in the silence of attentive hearts. May we have ears to hear and hearts brave enough to respond.